Welcome to the Bullpen. In the Bullpen today, I have Christopher Neiweem. I think I said that correctly. Republican advisor, founder of American Veterans Policy Network, and founder of the Neiweem Group. Good day, sir. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Richey. I appreciate it.
Let's talk about police reform, specifically in the context of policy. Generally, are you for or against police reform?
I would say I'm generally for police reform if it's going to be something that's going to make policing more efficient, more safe, and serve the societal value that it has. I think that's really the key question is what is the police reform and what is the goal of police reform? Where are we trying to go?
What ideas do you have? So you say you're for it. You're actually with the majority of Americans. Roughly 95% of Americans are for police reform. 58% of Americans say that reform must be dramatic. 51% of Republicans are for some level of police reform. But here's the issue. We disagree on the details of what reform is. So anytime I hear someone say, yes, I'm for it. Well, tell me what you are actually for in the reform space as it relates to policing.
Well, I think first we have to identify the problem, right? So I think that we would need to identify a problem. What is the problem that we are trying to solve in the context of police reform? And I think what's playing out now in America, it's very difficult to be a smart person. And it's very difficult to be someone with experience who studied statistics and had practical experience in the space. So I have a former military police background, obviously a lot of contacts in law enforcement communities, but also a lot of contacts in advocacy communities and civil rights communities. So we need to figure out what is the problem we're trying to solve in the police reform context. Because I think if we don't have the problem, there's absolutely no purpose in going through all of the possible policy prescriptions to solve it.
Brother, I'm sorry, man. I feel like you just said a whole lot of nothing. I want you to actually talk about a reform policy that you agree with. You've established on the show, you are for police reform. You establish you want to make sure you're thoughtful about what it is. And I'm giving you an opportunity to say, here's what you believe in as far as reform is concerned.
Sure. So I asked what the problem was, Dr. Richey. That's what I asked. I asked what the problem was. Once we identify the problem, we can figure out what we're reforming. I mean, obviously, organized police forces started back in England and Europe. They've migrated to the US. We have organized police forces that follow laws and they have policies and they have there's different policing styles from enforcement to community. There's obviously urban communities, there's rural communities. There's a variety of different ways in which police activities have. And I presume we're talking about the high profile cases that are streamed through the news every day about particular individual cases. So I support body cameras on police officers. I support commissions to look at techniques and tactics that officers deal with, and also support community policing, which is having civic groups and local leaders meet with police leaders to identify what problems are happening in society and what they can be doing differently. So I think that helps the direction of the conversation if we know what the problem is in terms of what areas of policing we should be changing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you just named some policies, and thank you for naming some policies. Do you know what you just described, brother? Do you know what you just listed?
I just listed some ideas about police reform in the context of policing and still a search for the biggest problems we don't discuss.
All right, so you broke up a little bit at the end, but I got the gist of what you're saying. What you just listed, everything you just said, is actually inside of the George Floyd Policing and Accountability Act of 2020. However, that act is universally disagreed upon by those on the right. So let's talk about that act in specific. What parts of the George Floyd Policing and Accountability Act do you disagree with?
So I think one of the challenges with major legislative pushes is most members of Congress get very little input into that bill. I mean, leadership drafts a lot of those bills. So if you're an individual member, it's at least in the US House, you get very little input to actually amend that bill, whether it's in a committee or before it goes to the floor. So I think my first issue with the legislation is it greatly inputs each individual member of the US House's ability to actually put their input into the bill, number one. I think so. There's a lot of material in bills. Obviously, there's a variety of amendments and content. Glancing through the bill, reading the summary, reading some of the provisions, part of my concern about the bill is really kind of twofold. One, it's very easy to block a bill, especially a major bill in the Senate, where then nothing gets done and we get nothing. So we don't have any kind of compromise and we end up with no particular product. There are some things, for example, banning of techniques. I think we have to be careful in that space, because banning techniques, what are the other causal effects? Looking at police incidents, outcomes. It's very difficult, and if you interview anyone with law enforcement experience, I have some, you're gonna get these completely broad and departed views from experiences in the practical reality.
So let me ask you this, because you did take me to a particular part of the bill. The bill would ban chokeholds. Good thing or bad thing? Do you need a chokehold in order to perform policing?
You could.
Okay, so let's be very clear. Chokeholds are, the majority of police precincts actually already ban chokeholds, number one, which proves that statistically, you don't need it in order to operate or perform your duties as a law enforcement officer. So why would you be against the use of chokeholds? You gotta remember, man, you're a former law enforcement guy. Cops have combat training. They have multiple non-lethal devices, weaponry. They also have training to de-escalate an aggressive situation. So they have all of this training. You mean to tell me that they can only perform their job, their duties, if they're able to choke somebody out in a chokehold that has been deemed against policy by the majority of precincts around the country?
I think if you're following the rules of force and the broad police training, I think that the idea that you would need that would be extremely limited. I could certainly draw up some scenarios where you could have an officer who is knocked to the ground, or for example, smaller in stature, a female officer, where that could be their last opportunity against a citizen that's 220 pounds. And as we know, many police officers get killed in the line of duty and aren't weighing in on this bill either, because they were killed. And we have citizens that have been killed. So I take the issue very seriously. Whichever direction we go, I'm also a veteran of war, so I understand having your life in jeopardy, being in combat situations, being in difficult situations involving law enforcement. So I take it seriously. What frustrates me are a lot of politicians and policy people that don't actually want to get a bill through. They don't actually want to improve certain aspects of society, because it would take away from the great benefits of keeping people divided and keeping the friction burning on the issue. That's kind of one of my frustrations.
Listen, and I get that, man. Everybody who's a politician to some degree will play politics. I do make a distinction between a politician and a public servant. So, right, a lot of politicians will play politics with these various bills. Let me be very clear about my stance. I don't care why they promote a certain bill. I don't care why they vote the way they vote. That's between them and God. I don't care if they are authentically connected to the bill or not. I do care about how they vote on the bill. That's between me and them. Their motive behind it, we can debate that in another conversation. But the bill itself, I want you to focus on the policy. The policy itself says we're gonna ban no-knock warrants. We're going to ban these chokeholds. We're going to increase and encourage community policing, things that you agree with, and you still have this universal no from people who are on your side of the political equation. I don't get that, brother. If you can sit here in a conversation with me and say, Doc, these are things that I'm actually for, right? Why aren't Republicans pushing legislation to promote these reform policies?
If I had to guess, I would say they don't want to get trapped. And what I mean by that is we're looking at different. So
they're playing politics then?
Of course they're playing politics. I mean, well, let me ask you this. I think it's germane to the discussion. Are you familiar with the Breathe Act, the legislative proposal, the Breathe Act?
Somewhat, yes.
Okay, the Breathe Act is a bill, and it's a mega bill. There's many provisions in it that was produced by Black Lives Matter Global Network, the more formal organization, produced some legislative prescriptions that has not been introduced, at least in this Congress. I don't think it was introduced. It was a blueprint in the last Congress. And there is a wide sweeping series of proposals in there. But among those are things that are fairly radical, abolishing federal law enforcement, things of that nature. And those are only part of the provision. So that's sort of a mega bill. I think that.
But what does that bill, brother, that's not even part of the mainstream conversation in politics, period. What does that bill have to do with the George Floyd Act?
Sure. Oh, it's actually very part of the conversation, Dr. Richey. It's actually very part of the conversation. Well, these are policy prescriptions that have been promoted by members in the Democrat Party that they want to see.
A minority of members of the Democratic Party.
Okay, it hasn't made it into this bill, but there are many different provisions in there. They might not want to get. It's a take-off process.
That doesn't work on this show, brother. So number one, the bill.
Well, how about this, Dr. Richey? How about this? How about this?
Wait a minute. The bill that you're talking about is considered to be extreme, even by the standards of many liberals, progressives, et cetera, inside of the Democratic Party. It has not been adopted into the mainstream. One bill does not have anything to do with the other. The George Floyd Policing Act is a good bill based on policy. When you break down the policy, 88% of Republicans actually agree with the policies that are in the bill. It's kind of like Obamacare, where over 80% of Republicans agree with Obamacare until you told them it was Obamacare. That number jumped down to 22%. So once again, you have a very similar instance even here. I don't have unlimited time with you. I do want to get your comments and your inquiry on the record about qualified immunity. Qualified immunity basically creates a protection between the behavior of law enforcement and any type of liability beyond that behavior. Do you agree with qualified immunity, or should there be some common sense reform to limit or eliminate that barrier of qualified immunity with police officers?
I think there should be some reform there. When I hear common sense, I kind of roll my eyes because it's just so difficult to figure out what that is these days. But I think there should be some limits to it. There should be some accountabilities and for outlandish comment. But we have to look at what the scope of that, because we also, if we had every single police officer in court with the millions and millions of interactions and traffic stops that where there's not any kind of a violent incident or any kind of an incident, we wouldn't be able to have any kind of functioning whatsoever. So I would support some of that in a limited capacity.
All right, let me push this on you. Now I'll let you respond. I know you got to follow up, but let me say this to you. I'm glad that you're open to the conversation. That actually means something, okay? Qualified immunity, the origin of qualified immunity came from southern states, and it was endorsed by Dixiecrats at the time. And it basically said, we are going to create a protection between law enforcement and civil rights activists because we don't want them to be sued for them bashing in the head of these black children. We don't want them to lose their homes. We don't want them to lose their assets. We don't want them to have to pay out personal liability for operating outside of the law. And that's why these qualified immunity bills were passed and signed into legislation. So it's already problematic at the origin of it. The DNA of the bill is rooted in racism, number one. Number two, when you look at qualified immunity, many people will say, well, the reason why we have qualified immunity is because policing is so dangerous. And it's kind of the argument that you're making, right? You would have a lot of tort law happening if you get rid of qualified immunity. But policing is not the most dangerous profession in America. As a matter of fact, cutting down trees is the most dangerous profession in America as it relates to death and actual harm or injury. Being a convenience store worker is more dangerous. Being a taxi cab driver is statistically more dangerous than being a police officer. So you can't use that argument to justify the constitutional intrusion. And then thirdly, as it relates to qualified immunity, if a police officer is operating within the boundaries of the law, they are immune anyway from prosecution or civil liability. It's only when they operate outside of that rule or outside of that protocol would then they be personally liable for the constitutional violation or the criminality or the criminal act against the individual. Why is that a problem, brother? Because medical doctors have a higher standard of care, psychiatrists have a higher standard of care, and then police officers have a lower standard of care when interacting with the community. That makes no sense to me.
Well, I mentioned that I'd be open to some amendments to qualified immunity. I mean, there's a lot to unpack. Is there? Did you know that currently 60% of police officers don't wear body cameras? I mean,
yeah, as a matter of fact, brother, that's why the George Floyd Policing and Accountability Act should be promoted. If you have a problem with the fact that all cops don't have on body cameras. Well, let's get some legislation on the books that mandates it. It mandates it for federal, but it also provides a way to take away money from police agencies that do not operate in best practices. That's a good thing if you have a problem with the fact that they don't all have body cameras.
I do. I mean, one of the clients I've had the opportunity to work with is the second largest body camera company in the world, and they've got contracts.
And see, look at that. You'll get, brother, and you'll get paid, brother. Look, you win in both ways. If you get everybody mandated with body cameras, not only do we win as black, brown, and marginalized people in America, but you win with your own personal business.
Well, of course, but here's the point, though. Why hasn't that get done? And we also have the Democrats have taken control of the government. I mean, I guess that's my question: is these key items that they could do haven't been done. And my other issue.
Let me remind you. Wait a minute. Let me remind you. 94% of Democrats in leadership are actually for universal use of body cams. Over 80% of Republicans are still against it. I think the problem was with your party, sir. You need to talk to your fellow Republicans as to why they are uniformly against the idea of having body cams for everyone.
Sure. Well, that's a conversation that's going on. I mean, I think there's other issues. There's also in this entire conversation, there's certain variables that are game-changing variables or keystone variables that change a whole host of things in this reform. That if I were sitting in Congress, which I'm not, that I would be looking at and discussing. I mean, for me, when I look at these particular incidents, and there's a lot of baseline things here I don't think we're discussing today. I think it would be very beneficial if we did. I mean, I look at things, I sit back and I try to listen to learn, not to listen to respond. And when I look at statistics, and when I look at health and human services, and I look at homeless issues, and when I look at statistics of having African Americans today, 12% of the population of being half of the homeless population, I think that is a major problem. And no one addresses that problem, and policymakers don't address that problem. And then when you have societal issues that rise, I don't necessarily think that the people working on the legislation in Congress want to get it done, because there's such a benefit now, and there's such a business in keeping the entire world divided on actual reforms. And as you know, the Constitution is written in a way, essentially in the Senate, it's very difficult to get a major bill through. It's very easy for one senator to hold it up. So sure. The challenge is there's so many different things we could be discussing.
And brother Christopher, I got to bring you back, man. I'm coming to the end of the show, but I want to say thank you. Number one, I agree with you on the policy issue as it relates to homelessness, something that I've been fighting for many years. And truthfully, you know, this comes down to local government. A lot of that comes down to what the local government is doing to address that policy. Federal government can be a partner in that, but the local government has to be the catalyst and the leader as it relates to getting that problem under control. I want to bring you back, man, because I do believe people like you may save some of the Republican Party, because you make a whole lot of sense on some stuff. Now, there's plenty of stuff I completely disagree with you on, right? But you actually are open to a policy conversation and a policy discussion about what Americans care about. They care about policy, they care about homelessness, they care about police reform, and you're not totally cut off to that conversation. So I want to say thank you for joining me on Indisputable.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.